Okay, everybody, thank you for joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then as people trickle in or join us on Facebook Live, it'll be easy enough to catch up. So today we're going to talk about a number of digital resources for South Asian studies. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Brandon Miliate. I'm the librarian for South and Southeast Asian Studies at Yale University. I joined Yale University as the librarian in last July. And so I haven't been here quite a year yet, but had a really fun time digging into these resources and bringing my own academic and professional training to this position, and it's sort of influenced the way I've done collecting. So I'm going to talk about that a bit as well. Now, I completed my PhD last May in political science, during which time I also worked as assistant to the South Asia librarian at Indiana. So that's sort of my academic background. Now, I was a very non-traditional political scientist, and so I took a lot of courses in anthropology on ethnography. I took a lot of courses in area studies, both in South Asian politics, as well as Central Asian politics and ethnic history, and ended up writing a dissertation on nationalist movements, really right at the intersection of India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, so in Northeast India, and then in Chin State on the Myanmar side. And so I really do come from a background that actually is both within South and Southeast Asian studies, academically speaking. And so it kind of provides me with a really fun perspective of straddling these interregional lines, as well as sort of hanging out really in the periphery of both regions, as well as the center. And so a lot of that will influence the way I've structured this talk as well, and the way that I work on building these collections. Now I'm going to move over to screen share so you can see my slides. And we're just going to work through this step by step. So I have a bit of a plan of attack here that we're going to follow for the duration of our time together. I'm going to give a little overview about the collections, the South Asia collections in particular, and how I go about building that collection. I'm also going to talk a bit about the advantages of digital archives beyond just the fact that those are the only archives a lot of you will have access to at this point in time, right? They have really long-term advantages too, so we're going to talk about that. I'm going to take you through 4 different online resources that I chose because I thought they were kind of the most interesting, as well as the most indicative of the kinds of collections we have here at Yale. And it's a mix of open access resources that are available for anybody, and then a couple of licensed resources as well that you'll need to be on the Yale VPN client in order to access in the future. And then I'm going to kind of conclude by talking about some of the library-wide projects that we have, and really sort of nationwide projects aimed at making more and more e-resources available for the population at large, but also for Yale patrons more broadly. And then kind of a little tongue-in-cheek reference to rational choice theory from political science. I'm going to talk about maximizing your utility as a library patron, and sort of some little hints and advice for working with librarians and working with resources throughout your research cycle, just as a way of summarizing through. Now, I think really one of the really advantageous things about Yale's South Asia collection is that it is driven really to meet the research and teaching needs of Yale faculty and students. And so it's not the case that I'm trying to kind of make sure that we have enough materials for everything, and kind of just being, you know, kind of surface level on a lot of things. Actually, the collection is driven by directly by faculty research interests, teaching interests, and then students, student projects and student interests, both graduate students and undergraduate students. Now, what this has meant in the past, because Yale has such a tradition of teaching Sanskrit, right, and several prominent Sanskritists landed at Yale very early on. And we've had a Hindi teaching program for quite a while. That's meant that a lot of our sort of niche collections, or the things that we're best known for, have been our Sanskrit collections and our Hindi language sort of publications that we hold on site. We also have a Tamil. Tamil used to be something that Yale was collecting heavily, because for a little while it was being taught. Now it hasn't been taught for a while, so as a result, we haven't been collecting as much in that, but you'll find that we have more materials in Tamil than you might expect, going back to support what used to be a teaching emphasis in the program. I should also add that beyond sort of languages like Sanskrit and Hindi, we've collected quite an impressive collection of materials, religious studies materials, especially related to Jain studies and to support the research of faculty more broadly as well. So Jain studies, as well as Hindu and Islamic texts and things like that, are also sort of prominent in the collection. Now, as I've been getting to know student interests here and interacting with faculty and council members, one of the things that I sort of immediately recognized, that even though we're not teaching Bengali, we have quite a few either Bengali heritage speakers or students who have subsequently learned Bengali to support their research and their fieldwork. And although we've always had a Bengali collection and a collection of Bengali materials, I've been working to continue building that collection and making sure that we keep adding to that, right? I think it's sort of recognition that Bengali is a core language of the constituency, even if we can't see that on the course catalog necessarily. And then relatedly, both related to my own interests in Northeast India, but also related to graduate student interests more broadly, and the fact that it's a region that has been, that went from being completely inaccessible to so many students and researchers, whether within India or outside of India. As Northeast India kind of opens up and various kinds of research opportunities emerge, I think it's increasingly important to get materials on that region as well. And so I've been, alongside increasing our holdings for Bengali, I've been sort of working to see what opportunities and what options might be available for Northeast India as well. Now, beyond that, I'm also explicitly interested in really kind of thinking about ways that we can connect the South Asia collection to the Southeast Asia collection, or connect the South Asian collection to the Middle East Studies collection, right? Afghanistan sort of being the obvious overlap in countries that I collect for, and countries that the Middle East Librarian collects for here at Yale. And so I've been working on ways that we can sort of leverage these resources, and ways of combining them in something I'm calling kind of a borderland studies, informally sort of borderland studies collection, if you will, as well as finding ways to support comparative research, recognizing that a lot of people within the South Asia Council here at Yale and more broadly are approaching South Asia not necessarily in an exclusive, focused way, but also are expanding far outside of that region, right? So comparing India to Brazil to China and so on. I think making, adding resources, but also talking about and organizing those resources in ways to support that endeavor is very important, something that I continue to work on. So all this is to say, right, that the collection is almost entirely built based on my knowledge of faculty and student interests, as well as the knowledge of my various very talented predecessors, of course. And so it's really to everybody's advantage, and I just want to kind of make that plug, it's really to everyone's advantage to make sure that that me, your South Asia Studies librarian, knows about your interests. And so even when you're not looking for specific materials, or your research question is still kind of nebulous, chatting with me about those interests and giving me a sense of what kinds of materials you're going to be looking at in the future, or what kinds of materials you might want to look at now to decide to decide whether your future plans are feasible and how you might want to go about structuring your study. It's always great. It's always great to connect and then let me kind of know that, and I will start making sure that those needs are met, right? It takes a little time and I have limited resources, but I'll do everything that I can to get that going. Now to move really into the bread and butter of today's talk, I want to talk about our digital archives and our digital collections specifically. And I kind of wanted to start with a little cheer for digital resources. Now, obviously, right now, a lot of us, if not all of us, are stuck with digital resources as sort of our exclusive research materials. And that will be the case for a little while. But even moving forward into the future and post this current situation, I think that you'll find that digital resources offer several key advantages, right? Even though, importantly, we continue to, there's still kind of a favoring for physical archives and getting your sort of hands, in most cases, literally dirty in physical archival settings. And that's, of course, very important and something that actually I have plenty of experience with myself. But using digital resources at different stages in your research can really help either round out and supplement that physical archival experience, or really sort of serve as the core for a number of different research projects, especially for student papers and so on. The first thing, of course, that makes these things so useful is that you have the ability to identify and locate materials in a much faster and much more intuitive way, hopefully, right? Not in every case, but most of the time, digital archives have keyword search capabilities. They're divided into categories that can kind of make sense once you've dug into the materials. They'll often link those materials together so that you can easily find all the letters by a specific political actor that you might be interested in, for example, or all the maps published by a particular publishing agency along the way, right? That makes that experience much easier than in your typical sort of physical archival settings. As well as sort of visual aids and different teaching aids. And we're gonna look through a couple of those specifically today, looking at ways that you can utilize those visual aids, not just in your teaching, but also to support your own research and sort of see connections in ways that you might not have otherwise been able to, right? That in a physical archival setting, you might have been more restricted in. Related to this, of course, is access, right? So you have easy access from home, easy time downloading and printing those materials. As anybody who has done research in archival settings in South Asia, and of course, it's quite a varying state, but my experience, at least, for doing research in Northeast India, both at the Mizoram State Archives and the Assam State Archives, is that I had to bring in something like 5 copies of my passport photo. I had to fill out the form in triplicate. I had to show various copies of my university letter from my university in the U.S., letter from my university hosts in India, a letter from the grant agency, and then so all these sorts of things you're kind of compiling, and that can become quite a fun bureaucratic hassle. Those are things you're not encountering with digital archives, right? So you get kind of a little bit of ease with that. I think that's wonderful, especially in the beginning stages, to help you kind of narrow down what you need to look for and things like that. And then finally, of course, and something that I think maybe is understated a lot is that a lot of these digital archives compile materials from multiple physical archives. So that some of the things that we're looking at, for example, Empire Online, that we'll see in a second, has materials that are normally housed in the British Library and as well as in several different archival sites in India. And so you can imagine that even under best case scenario with a decent amount of grant money, that it would be hard to spend a significant amount of time in multiple archives across the world to do your research, and digital archives can provide you that kind of access, which is why they're still wonderful and important. They also allow me to do, they allow me to both deepen our emphasis on you know, on Hindi and on Sanskrit materials, as well as sort of our secondary interests in terms of Urdu language materials or environmental studies and economics and so on. But they also allow me to kind of expand outward and bring us materials from and about Nepal or Bhutan or Tibet, places that we don't normally heavily collect. There's always some collecting going on for those regions, but we don't usually heavily collect in those, and digital archives are a really easy way for me to start bringing those materials in to support wider research interests. So I'll just do this little plug, right, is that there's this sense, I think, that sometimes people have this sense that digital archival materials are not as, you know, are not as valuable as those that you find in a physical archive. And of course, that's not the case at all, right? They're in fact still primary resources. And in fact, they actually offer you, I think, a really good opportunity to start questioning how you want to approach those materials and sort of the methodological, or even to be particularly grad student seminary about it, right? Even to think about sort of the epistemological or ontological concerns of using archival materials and what they show and what they don't show. And so, of course, digital archives are collections put together, but often put together either by librarians and scholars, or alternatively by librarians and scholars working for an institution or a private vendor. And so there are kind of interesting, and I think actually, you know, kind of thought-provoking, critical ways of dealing with those materials, to think about what's included and what you have access to and what you don't, that we can sometimes forget to do when we're in our physical archives, because we sort of feel like as all of our energy is going into finding the materials, we can often sort of lose some of that chance to start questioning those materials and working with them in a critical fashion. I think digital archives, you can't forget that. And I think that's actually a really exciting advantage to them as well, into working with them, rather than sort of a disadvantage. I think it's something you can turn into a strength of your research if you engage with them properly. Now let's start moving into this a little bit more substantively, a little bit more concretely. And so we're going to look at 4 or 5 different digital resources that are on my research guide for South Asia. I have the link here on the slide, and you can all see it just fine. But I will tell you that you don't need to necessarily write down this link. You can very easily Google South Asia collection at Yale. It's on. It's also linked to my profile on the council's webpage and the library's webpage. And if anybody's curious, I can show you how to access it directly from the library's website. So you can see all the different kinds of research guides that various subject librarians have put together for you within the Yale University Library more broadly. So if you were to go to this link, it would take you to this page. This is the primary page. This page really should be your best friend for anybody interested in South Asian studies here at Yale, but also, you know, if you're outside of Yale, making a stop here and seeing comparing this to other research guides is always a good thing. I kind of often find things elsewhere too, and try to make sure that we're cross-referencing as much as we can to sort of take advantage of relationships between South Asia collections in the US. Now, the first thing that I've changed here is, of course, I've added this COVID-19 box on the top. Within this, I've linked to several important updates from the university, as well as to kinds of general library services and support that existed previously but have been greatly expanded as the library has moved to an online format. So even as librarians are working from home, we still are working very hard to make sure that things like chat services or remote assistance are working actually for technical services to get you access to as many resources as possible. There's also a number of free trials that I'm going to talk about again in a second that Yale sort of putting together, and I wanted to highlight those on my library guide as well. Now, normally, I would encourage everybody to go to the collection highlights tab of this and take a look at the awesome things that we have in the Bionicki and that we have in Manuscript and Archives. Unfortunately, you don't have access to the ones that, there are some digitized things, so take a look perhaps, but you don't have access to the physical materials at this time. And so today I'm gonna focus on the digital archives that we have. Now, I normally make this kind of statement where I say, because I'm not necessarily, because my academic training is not in librarianship, I never caught on to the feeling that I needed to make a really long list of resources. I always wanted to tailor it and keep it sort of as low as possible. But now that we're all off campus, I've started to expand these lists quite extensively. And so it might be a little bit overwhelming how long these lists have gotten. And there's also a lot of overlap between digital archives and open access resources at this point. But as I keep organizing and finding better ways to present this information, hopefully it'll become a little bit stronger over time. Now I've included a little box here on methodological questions about digital archives, which will kind of give you some instruction on how to use them in a critical way, or at least sort of help you start on that process. It's also things that might help you if you're crafting your doctoral prospectus and various other kinds of grant proposals, to be able to talk about the value of those in your research, right? This gives you some options. I put literary resources over here a little bit separately, just to make it a little bit easier for faculty and students that are in literature to have kind of a tailored list, although of course there's going to be plenty of overlap. And then the bulk of the items are in the center, primary digital archives and primary resources. Now, the first thing that I wanted to show you all is an open access project called the South Asia Open Archives, or Sawa. Now this link will take us directly to Sawa because it's not a licensed resource. And this is one of the things that you don't necessarily have to be on Yale PPM to access. You absolutely don't have to be. Now, although it's hosted on JSTOR, it is all open access. You don't have to have an institutional subscription to JSTOR even to access this website. So Sawa, or the South Asia Open Archives project, is something that is been built in collaboration with and sort of direct relationship with the Center for Research Libraries, as well as the South Asian Materials Project. And it's a huge collection. It's been growing. It was just launched last October. And so it's just been growing since then. It currently has over 15,000 different items. And that includes pamphlets, full books, and serials, all available freely and in quite high quality scans, all searchable, keyword searchable, and sort of categorized nicely for your use. You'll see there's a pretty good representation of languages, with it being a little heavy on the Bengali and English side of things, but still, as it continues to expand, I think you'll see that the number of languages represented will balance out over time. Another cool thing about this project is that, with some exceptions, it really is materials that are not available, either not available anywhere else or not available open access anywhere else. And so as a result, it's really kind of a special project. I think it's just wonderfully well done. Now I was sort of looking through this, and I thought one of the things that caught my eye was that there is a separate category for women and gender. I know that many of our colleagues in the South Asia Council work on issues of gender, as well as within sort of societal issues more broadly in India. And I think this will kind of give you some really interesting archival materials to work through, especially some of these kind of funnier, some of these kind of very interesting and very engaging serials put out by various Christian organizations, especially Christian organizations for women. And so this afternoon I was looking at the Indian Ladies magazine, and you'll see that it's all there. The whole series is there, and very easily accessible, and loads of quite nice things. These are very nice quality scans that you can easily search through. I found the advertising particularly interesting. There's a couple advertisements in the beginning and the back, and I had a really fun time kind of engaging with that and thinking about the readership of this and sort of how they're choosing advertisers and so on. So something to take a look at. And it's also just really kind of a fun thing to dig through more broadly, even without a specific a specific topic in mind. I think it's kind of a fun thing to look through. Now to jump around a little bit, I wanted to access this is another open access thing. It's called the AHAR. It's a little misleading. It's Mountains of Central Asia Digital Database. It does have Central Asian materials on it, but I think that we can think about it primarily in terms of a Himalayan studies archive. And it's quite extensive. So I was, as I was digging through this, I was quite impressed by the number of books that are full PDFs on there. Some of them I had a little trouble downloading, so you might find that to be a problem. But by and large, most of them downloaded just fine. They're as a PDF, so easily accessible for most people. And one of the things to highlight is this is a good example of the kind of thing that allows us access to materials on Bhutan, for example, that I otherwise would not be heavily collecting it. And you can see that it's actually, the date range is quite extensive, going back to 1825. And this sort of gives you, this could give you some really exciting insights into how colonial India was interacting with Bhutan, as well, perhaps as how Bhutan was interacting with colonial India, sort of a diplomatic history, if you will, that I think could be sort of invaluable for thinking about Himalayan studies, as well as the expansion of sort of British control into India more broadly. So this I think offers some really powerful, interesting resources that's certainly fun to use. They also have a number of maps that's from the whole region that I think would be really exciting, as well as old photos and so on that you can take a look at. Okay. Now I want to move into a couple of items that are licensed items. They're items that are often, they have been purchased by many academic libraries with an interest in sort of collecting for South Asia. So they're not exclusive to Yale, but the things that we do purchase and we do own a license for, so you'll need VPN or be on a Yale network computer when we are able to go back to campus in the future in order to access these materials. I wanted to highlight, we're not gonna do too much digging, but I wanted to highlight Archives Unbound as something that's kind of different and maybe a little bit less than intuitive in terms of how you access it. Archives Unbound is something put together by Yale, and it's really a combination of a bunch of different archival collections. And so within Archives Unbound, I've highlighted several things that are specific to South or Southeast Asia. There's always a little bit of overlap. I think if you went into US relationships and policies in Southeast Asia, you would find things related to South Asia as well. So it's always, I think it's always good to kind of be broad in your searching. But I've highlighted several things within that collection that are specific to us. But when you go to Archives Unbound, and because it's a Yale licensed thing, you have to access it through it links through Quick Search. You click on Online Database, and it will take you here. Now, when you search, you don't need to search by one collection. You can search within everything that Yale owns and has access to. And I'm happy to say that everything related to South Asia we have purchased. So, and most of the things related to Southeast Asia we have purchased as well. So you have a lot of collections to choose from. You don't necessarily need to be digging into each collection, although that's a really great way to kind of explore and discover topics you might not have thought of. You can still do other searches by keyword and by title, and it will search through all the collections. But if you do want to limit by collection, you have the option to do that as well. You notice that we have access to quite a few. Now to move out of Archives Unbound, I wanted to look at some of the really cool visual resources that we have available through several of these online archives, primarily those from a vendor, Adam Matthews. So the first one I wanted to look at was East India Company. Again, it's a licensed resource. It will link from my LibGuide into Quick Search. And then just takes a second to pull up. And you'll see that from here, you have a couple options. You can look directly through the documents and search through them. And that's, of course, wonderful. And there's lots of great resources to look through. I wanted to highlight, though, some interesting features that I think are very helpful for students or more seasoned researchers who aren't always sure how to use archival resources in their research or in the classroom, right? So one of the first things I wanted to show up was this chronology, because I find this very useful myself as somebody who's sometimes a little bit hazy on the exact dates of various events in South Asian history. And sometimes I tend to think about these things very linear thing, like, you know, A happened and then B happened and then C happened. And it's often the case that multiple things are going on at once, as you would actually expect. And this is a great way to highlight that and to see various events happening in the same year, how events sort of feed off of each other and how things build. And this is a sort of a wonderful way of doing that. And you'll see that from this chronology, it will link to the various materials within this digital collection that you have access to, right? That relate to that event. So I think that's just fantastic, and really, I think, very useful for everybody. And you can sort of work by category and era to limit this chronology more if you wanted to for your students, so they have a little more tailored experience. They also have this great data visualization option, and you'll see that it gives you some instructions about how this works. Read through that, have a fun time. But when you go to just view map, it'll give you some really kind of cool data on imports and exports, right, based on documents and records from the East India Company. And you can limit that by item over time, and it will help you sort of visualize where these things are going from, are coming from, where they're produced, where they're going, and then give you some interesting material in the side panel to further guide that. So I think this is a really cool resource, especially for teaching and for, I think, sort of encouraging students to kind of explore and see how primary source documentation, what otherwise looks like kind of a dusty, tattered 200-year-old piece of paper, can be turned into something that is readable for a contemporary audience and has this kind of power, the kind of explanatory power that these kinds of visualizations, graphs and maps and so on give us. I think that's something that's always exciting to look through. From the same vendor, but a different collection, there's several things. India, Raj and Empire is also part of this and has similar functionality, but I thought Empire Online would be something that we could look at together as well. Because, and it just takes a while for it to refresh this from the same vendor. There it comes. Fantastic. It's not right up on top here, but if you go to the interactive map in the quick links, or you'll see that it will give you some visualizations. And I think that you know, anybody sort of a critical eye can sort of wonder on the value of just like a very basic fill in the polygon kind of map, but it gives you a fun sense of timeline that can be helpful for teaching and to give a sense of how things have changed over time. I sort of enjoy watching, going here, right, so 1754, and you sort of see where it plots British holdings in particular, and then you fast forward a little over 100 years and suddenly there's a lot more pink on that map. So it is sort of interesting in that way. It also gives you some kind of exciting ways of looking through these materials in terms of patterns of world trade and colonization, broken down in this case, first Africa sort of defaults, but then it will bring us to British India as well. Right, and it's of course always fair game to critique these images and think about them critically, but I think also just in terms of general teaching and visualization aids, they certainly serve a great purpose. Okay, the final resource that I wanted to show you before I think I've exhausted everybody's patience even though as far as I know, I'm just sitting here talking to my computer screen for the past half hour. I really enjoy this resource because this is a literary resource, so South and Southeast Asian literature in English. Now, the reason why I find this really exciting is that I really got, my background is actually was initially sort of in Central Asian studies. As you might have seen from the tapestry behind me when it was showing my video image. Specifically sort of Mongolian studies. And after reading Amitav Ghosh's The Glass Palace, I became sort of obsessive about learning more about South Asia and Myanmar. It sort of served as really great inspiration for me in my academic career, and then sort of further into my professional career. So I always think that literature is a great place to be exploring, even if you're not pursuing a degree in the humanities or in the literary field. Now, this thing is put together by Alexander Street. You have some very useful ways of searching. You can also just browse, and as a browser of literature, I think it's fantastic to approach it that way. You'll see that it's broken down by country if you go to place. It's not a huge amount of material for every country, but it gives you kind of a representative sample. I was earlier today looking through Bangladesh into Said Islam's work, and of course it decides to not work for me today for this, but it does work in general, I do promise. Very silly. See if we can't just pull up. It does work in general. I just decide, okay, here we go, good. So here's something by H.C. Jute. It gives a couple options. It has nonfiction writing, but primarily we're talking about poetry and we're talking about fiction, various types of prose. And so it's just being very silly with me today. But in general, when things are working nicely, it will give you both a simple text version that you could easily copy and paste into Word or into sort of text analysis software for those of you who are interested in sort of digital humanities. But it will also give you a scan of that the page of the book. That also might provide some additional interest for those of you interested in kind of material culture of these items. And I hope that would help everybody, as well as just kind of enrich your literary interests more broadly. Those are the resources I really wanted to show off to you today, just because I found them particularly exciting, and I found them kind of nice explanations, but there's lots of other things to look through, and I encourage you to take a look closely at that, or send me an email if you want like kind of a tailored list of things that might be more interesting directly to you. I'm happy to tailor this further. I want to start wrapping up by noting these, I labeled them open access resources here. I think they might be better described as sort of public resources, but there's the list has a lot of variation in it. So I wanted to first note that the Internet Archive has made hundreds of ebooks available in the public domain, much to the concern of some authors and publishers, but nonetheless a great resource for you to use and to get access to some ebooks that we might not have here at Yale, or that just are kind of more broadly interesting to you intellectually or even for entertainment and so on. Yale specifically has put together a page for free resources. So these are temporary free resources. These temporary free resources are, well, they're temporary, quite obviously, but they're also things that have been negotiated directly with publishers or with vendors for us to have access to during this time while the library's physical resources and buildings are closed. So these are things that probably won't be around past spring, although they might extend them. Right? I don't, I'm not privy to those conversations. But they're things that you can look through now. I recommend taking a look. They're not divided by area studies and so on. They're more broad research materials. They also do include a section for like COVID-19 specific research. So those of you who can who find things like medical journals and professional writing in medicine to be useful during this time can also find some cool things through that. I'll also make a note that HathiTrust has put a number of items. HathiTrust is this digital repository library that has lots of resources from various libraries around the country. And despite the name, it is not an exclusively South Asia resource, although I think that we should just claim it. But a lot of things that were on their public domain have been included in Quick Search now, in Yale's Quick Search, so that you have access to those materials. So that will sort of further expand the number of ebooks and other kinds of e-resources that you'll have access to when using Quick Search. I also wanted to note that Quick Search has been modified and updated so that it's easier for you to exclude physical items that you won't have access to at this time, and to just get things that you can access now. And they've done that in a number of different ways that will make this whole experience, I think, much easier on everybody while the physical locations are closed. All right, so my little tongue-in-cheek thing about being a rational user, my little poking fun at rational choice, something I get to do since I got a political science PhD as my sort of my whole PhD experience. I think that you can think about maximizing your library utility in some interesting ways at this time, and I think even going forward. One of the things that I'll say is that it's really great if you can find a way to kind of combine different librarians and different library resources from different collections, right? So if you're working primarily within South Asian studies or Southeast Asian studies, then absolutely start working with me, and we can kind of see what resources might be available, as well as they'll just influence by collecting more broadly. So even if you don't necessarily need me to find a book, I might just find some books that are fun anyways and let you know about them down the way, along the way. But if you find that you're really going to be pursuing a project that involves a lot of spatial analysis, then work with me and the GIS librarian. If you find that it's going to be a very quantitatively heavy dissertation that you're working on, or research project, then work with me and one of our very talented data librarians in the Marks Library. Marks Library being the new name for the Center for Science and Social Science Inquiry. And that sort of combination can be very exciting and work really to your advantage, right? So get the maximum bang for your buck. The other thing is to not be, I had this very strange notion in my head for a while that digital archives were there for history students and that I needn't use them as a political scientist. And of course, I think that was quite a silly notion that I had. And so I always try to remind people that these digital archives can be useful for really sort of any disciplinary type study, as well as interdisciplinary work, obviously. And in fact, a lot of these primary documents include quantitative data. They include statistics. They include various types of demographic data and so on. They also have, they also include text that you could quantify, right? So different kinds of qualitative data that you could quantify either as a dummy variable or sort of terms of frequency of use and so on for use in various types of quantitative analysis. And so always be alert to the fact that these things might have multiple uses, and just how they're used more broadly or how they're initially advertised to you might not be the only option. Finally, I think I mentioned this earlier, is to think about how these resources might fit into your research at various stages. So of course, research is not a linear process, but if you kind of think about it in terms of your initial sort of proposal writing stage, the bulk of your research, and then your analysis and writing phase, you could be using different kinds of digital resources in different ways along the way, right? You might initially use digital archives to get a sense of what kinds of materials are out there, where they are, and sort of come to some initial conclusions or sort of theoretical frameworks within the proposal, and then revisit those again after you've done some research within physical archives to round out that research, or find little holes that you missed during your time in the field and so on. And that's just one model, and there's plenty of other ways that you can do that. But thinking about how that might change over time is something that I think is really useful throughout your academic career, both as a student and as faculty. Okay, and because I'm now getting a little bit hoarse and I've gone on for 45 minutes, just want to remind you the library is still open. Well, you know, not really, but kind of. The physical locations are, of course, closed for now. We will reopen eventually, but your librarians are still working from home and happy to work with you along the way. And I think we're all quite eager to do various kinds of Zoom consultations or email inquiries and so on. And so with that, I'm gonna stop the screen share and go back to my video. And then I'm gonna start handling some of the questions here that I have on the side. Ryan Martinez, I think, is gonna help me with some questions from the Facebook Live feed, and then anybody else who wants to chime in, who might be joining us directly on Zoom, is also welcome to. Just wanna see here. Thank you everybody who said nice things in the chat. Okay, so from Ryan sent me a question from Rifat Islam. It says, do you know what resources are available to learn Bengali at Yale for undergrads? So for right now, you know, I don't know, you know, obviously not in charge of curriculum or teaching, but right now we don't have Bengali taught on campus. But there is a yearly language workshop that you're probably aware of, SOSLI, that's hosted by Wisconsin. They're doing online classes this year. They're probably, I would imagine that they're, you know, that they don't have space for this summer for people, but next summer, Bengali is one of the languages that are often offered, and there's always enough demand, at least to teach Bengali 1. I'll also just alert you to the fact that the Critical Language Scholarship, which is actually what I used to study Bengali in Dhaka some years ago. It's now in Kolkata, but it used to be in Dhaka. As another summer program that you have options to. That also reminds me that on the research guide that I showed you, I'm gonna add a section on language study that will link to some of these study options, but also link to a couple of the online resources that have been put together for self-study that are available for free for you to use online that I think will also be valuable along the way. And yeah, Bengali is a fantastic language, so always happy to support that. Let's see, another question that Ranu sent me is there a way of downloading the chronology section from Empire Online? I don't think that you can download it. You might be able to copy and paste it, but I expect the formatting will get quite strange. But you might be able to open it, and then even if you're offline, maybe I'm not quite sure. I suspect not. They probably want you to access it only through. It's probably protected in various ways that only license holders can see it. Thank you all for these great comments, and I hope that this was very helpful. Fantastic to hear. So one more question that's come through is Yale planning on subscribing to the South Asia Archive? There will likely be a trial of South Asia Archive available in the coming weeks for some temporary access and for us to look at more closely to see what the value added of that might be to the collection. And so I think it's been reviewed a couple times, and so I'll continue to look at it. But hopefully we get a trial in so that any of the materials that we might have physically that they have online, we can begin to look at and see if it's really time to add that or not. Are there any other questions before we sign off? Just gonna give it a minute here. Okay, well, fantastic, everybody. Thank you so much. Feel free to get in touch with me through email. My email is on the, I think it's on the announcement that we sent out. It's easily findable. You know, if you're at Yale, you know it's my name. You can see on Zoom, Brandon.Miliate at yale.edu. Otherwise, South Asia Librarian Yale, Google search, you'll come up with me. And I look forward to hearing from you and working with you in the years to come, and I look forward to really making sure that our digital archives are here to support you in the months to come for the current situation as well. So thank you very much, everybody.